Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you might be. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. I am Safwan Masri, Columbia University Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development, and I am thrilled to welcome you to the inaugural event of the new and exciting joint book series between Columbia Global Centers and Columbia University Press. And I'm especially pleased that we are launching this series with my good friend and colleague, Jeffrey Sachs, featuring his latest book, The Ages of Globalization, Geography, Technology, and Institutions. I can't think of a better book or an author with a more global following to launch our new series. A quick word about Columbia Global Centers and Columbia University Press. The Global Centers are hubs of the university, currently in 9 cities around the world, that work with students, faculty, and local partners to create opportunities for shared learning and research, and to deepen the nature of global dialogue, something we desperately need more of at these critical times. Columbia University Press is one of the world's leading academic publishers. Now in its second century of publishing, it is the 4th oldest university press in the United States. Each year, the press publishes approximately 160 titles across a wide range of disciplines. Our new book series, In Conversation With, is inspired by a desire to bring global audiences together over a shared love of knowledge, a passion for books, and to give audiences like you direct access to authors of important works and cutting-edge ideas. Over the course of the next 12 months, we will be inviting specially chosen authors to discuss the newly released Columbia University Press books, pairing them with a carefully selected interviewer, someone we know will engage and challenge, like David Lawler from Axios, who will be interviewing Professor Sachs. This talk comes at an especially poignant moment, set against the backdrop of what is arguably the most significant global crisis in decades. Pandemics are by definition a global phenomenon. As much as globalization has ushered in the greatest era of prosperity and development in human history, it also made it possible for COVID-19 to spread to almost every country in the world in a matter of weeks. By contrast, as Professor Sachs points out in his book, it took 16 years for the bubonic plague to travel from China to Europe in the 14th century. As much as globalization has accelerated the virus's spread, international cooperation, whether in terms of vaccine development, international trade, or humanitarian assistance, has the potential to help mitigate the worst impacts of the crisis. And globalization helps us to remain connected across international borders in spite of restrictions on travel and physical distancing measures. Jeff's book is hot off the press. It was released just a few days ago. We are very fortunate to have him with us and to be among the first to hear him speak about it. Although Professor Jeffrey Sachs needs no introduction, I would still like to say a few words about him. He is a university professor at Columbia, director of the Center for Sustainable Development, and former director of the Earth Institute. At the United Nations, Jeff is director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and he has been advisor to 3 UN Secretaries General. Jeff is also a New York Times bestselling author many times over. I'm also very pleased that we have with us David Lawler of Axios. David was there as deputy news editor when Axios launched in 2017, and he has helped shape its distinctive approach and style. He is now Axios's world news editor, overseeing coverage of international affairs. David is the author of Axios World newsletter, and he previously worked at the London Daily Telegraph, including as Washington correspondent during the 2016 US presidential elections. Before I turn it over to David, a couple of housekeeping items. I encourage our audience members to submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We will try to get to as many questions as we can. It will be difficult as we have over 1,500 audience members with us between Zoom and our live feed. We also received a number of questions in advance that we will try to address. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of Jeff's book, we will be sharing a number of links in the chat box. Finally, a word of thanks to our multiple partners. Columbia's Committee on Global Thought, the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia's Earth Institute, the Earth Institute, the Columbia University Student Union for Sustainable Development, the Center on Global Economic Governance at Columbia School of International Public Affairs, the Masters in Public Administration, Environmental Science and Policy program at the School of International Public Affairs, and the bookstore Shakespeare and Company. With that, over to you, David.
Thanks, Safwan, and thanks so much to all of you for joining us today. It's my honor to host today's discussion, and I'm fortunate that it's about a book that I greatly enjoyed and also with a thinker that I really admire. So I see that questions are already coming in through the Q&A function, so please continue to ask those, and I will make sure to leave plenty of time for questions from the audience. So Jeff's book it's a history of globalization, but really it's a history of humanity. It starts 70,000 years ago with the Great Dispersal from Africa and leads us straight up to the crazy world we're all living in today. So I want to start in the current moment with two things that are on a lot of our minds, one of which is that the killing of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis has now sparked protests all over the world. A reminder that, an event that happens, in the middle of the United States can reverberate all over the globe. And also a virus that originated in Wuhan, China, has spread to every country on earth and is the reason for the Zoom existence that we're all living now. So Jeff, I just, starting in this moment, can you just talk a bit about what the last few months perhaps have taught us about this globalized world that we're living in?
I will try to do my best, David, and thank you for the chance to be with you. And Safwan, thank you for all of your leadership and for hosting this event, and how appropriate to talk about globalization with the Columbia Global Centers and the fact that we are having a worldwide instantaneous get-together and brainstorming. And indeed, as you say, whether it is the protests and against racism that have taken off all over the world in recent days, or a pandemic which engulfs the whole world, or the fact that we can now almost routinely meet, as we're doing, with participants from all over the world, we are so interconnected that it, again, fundamentally reshapes our reality. Politics, our economies are being reshaped at a faster rate in these weeks than in years and decades beforehand. We were gradually moving to the digital world. We have been pushed decisively into new forms of work that will not change. They will not revert. And that's happened just in recent weeks. So, of course, I knew all of this was going to happen when I wrote this book, and was perfectly prepared for this. Obviously not, as this book was going to press. The very last thing I did was say, oh my God, could I get in a few words about COVID-19? Because, of course, how could one have a book about globalization without the pandemic being featured? It is featured just at the last moment in the preface, to observe that, as the book had covered, there have been pandemics throughout history that have reshaped history. This one, too, will be part of reshaping history. We're living through something that is deeply consequential and, of course, deeply unsettling. I talk about in the book how the pathogens that came with the European conquerors to the Americas not only unfortunately, tragically destroyed native civilizations, but completely upended the world and changed the world in what's called the Columbian biological exchange. And we've had other epidemics of decisive importance in our own age, AIDS being a devastating disease and a reshaper of society as well. So we're at it again, and there will be more in the future, I'm sorry to say, because pandemics are part of a global world. But as David noted, what took years or decades in the past for pathogens to move across continents now takes hours. And so we all watched the maps in recent weeks as how this virus reached everywhere. And it did not take long, and we're in the height of the battle right now, because it's by no means even at the middle. There still is a growing epidemic in large parts of the world. The drama is only increasing, I'm sorry to say, and the consequences will be huge.
And Jeff, you said we will not revert, and your book tells the story over 70,000 years of really one trajectory, which is towards deeper connections between, more people over greater areas. But there are people now who would argue, smart people who would argue, that we've reached peak globalization, right? That now, especially this pandemic, is a reminder that we need to rethink supply chains. There's talks of countries exploring sovereign internets that will be severed from, the rest of humanity. I'm wondering what you think of those arguments, and whether you think there is any going back, or whether it's only going to continue on this path towards deeper globalization.
I think they're basically wrong, short of disaster. Yes, globalization has reversed in history at some decisive moments. One can think about the end of the Western Roman Empire and the return to local villages as being a reversal of globalization. One can think about the collapse of international trade and finance in the 1930s as being a reversal of globalization. But the first one's called the Dark Ages for a reason, and the second one is called the era of the Great Depression for a reason. So we could, of course, destroy the links which make a productive world. If we do so, the costs will be extraordinarily high. The idea that interconnections can lead to adverse consequences is obvious. The pandemic is exhibit A, but the idea that you fight that by somehow closing down the interconnections of the world is a very wrong approach. You fight a pandemic by public health, not by reverting to a localized life. If we actually do go in that direction, God help us, because there are 7.8 billion people on the planet, and in a localized set of economies, a lot of those people would not survive. So if we end up closing borders, shutting down trade, shutting down finance, going into one or more cold wars, the consequences, I think, would be horrendous. One of the motivations of the book is to say, can we learn to cooperate? This is obviously not something that comes naturally, and there are enemies of cooperation. Unfortunately, the President of the United States, exhibit A in that regard right now, deliberately trying to stoke a Cold War with China. And I don't say that casually, and I don't say that lightly. The more you know about what the US is trying to do right now, and I learn new things every day, the worse that aspect of US foreign policy actually is, because it's extremely dangerous. So David, the mere fact of our meeting right now is the new supply chains. The fact that the Columbia Global Centers will have virtual internships across the world this year is the new supply chains. The idea that the supply chains are being cut off because we look at some physical commodities misunderstands what the world economy is now. It's predominantly a service economy, and a service economy that operates across international boundaries. And the fact that the digital age makes it so remarkable what actually does transmit across international space means that only self-destruction which could happen, but only self-destruction would mean the reversal of the interconnectedness.
Your book does give some ammunition to critics of globalization, I guess. There are, I live in Washington. When the guy down the road, the president of the United States, talks about globalization or globalists, he's using it as an insult. He's basically saying these are the people who have built a world that's hurting the common person. And your book describes disease, obviously, which we've already discussed, war, even the slave trade as products of globalization. That globalization has brought us some of the ills of the world, certainly in recent decades or even recent centuries. I'm curious, having sat down with this history of globalization, force for good, force for ill, or does it not matter and it's just a fact of life and it's something that we have to adapt as best we can?
I think force for potential great good is how I would define things, and for that I would go back starting to the founder of modern economics, Adam Smith, who made some really, really smart points in The Wealth of Nations in 1776, when he talked about a world market enabling specialization, enabling innovation, enabling diversity, enabling one part of the world to help meet the needs and wants of other parts of the world. And the idea of the potential benefits of this interconnection is the most important idea. But of course, history shows all of those negative features of interdependence, because interdependence can also mean war. It can also mean subjugation. It can also mean the spread of pathogens. It can also mean even economic activity that destroys its own foundations by destroying nature, creating climate change through the use of fossil fuels, and so on. There's no doubt that there are two sides of almost any technology, and there are two sides of globalization. But the wisdom, in my view, is to think about how to gain the benefits and control the harms, rather than to destroy interdependence itself. If I could use a different historical analogy, we know that almost any advance in technology, any new machinery, puts some people out of work and helps others. It was in the early days of the Industrial Revolution in the 1820s that people came to smash the new machines. They were putting people out of work. And if we took the view that machines, technology, can be a destructive force, which undoubtedly it is almost automatically in part, we would basically give up and have given up the entire basis of advances of longevity, of our economic development over 2 centuries, and we would all be living in extreme poverty right now. So the idea was not smash the machines. The idea was create a society in which change is not devastating for those who are on the losing end. That's a philosophy of social democracy, which says everybody's in it and everybody should benefit from progress. It requires active work, redistribution, making the harms as limited as possible. And when it comes to globalization, this is the same point, that there are enormous benefits of global trade, of our interconnectedness, of our ability to learn from each other. And if we close our own society in the United States, which is in the mantra right now of Trump, or we divide the world, the consequences, I think, would be absolutely dangerous for us. And when it comes to Trump, I get to hear this guy every year in the UN General Assembly And he goes and stands in the podium of the greatest institution of global decency, the UN, and he attacks globalization. And while he is a talented demagogue, the fact of the matter is that his approach and way of thinking have landed our country in an uncontrolled epidemic because other countries have controlled it, but he doesn't have the competence to control it, a depression with double-digit unemployment, a social war right now because of the racism, and a geopolitical tension unmatched in modern history. And so I don't view him with a lot of credibility. I think he's leading us on a path to disaster, and I can't wait to see him go. So when he says globalization's bad, it only musters my confidence that he must be wrong once again.
There are a lot of threads that I could pull on from what you've just said, but since you mentioned Adam Smith and the distribution of wealth, I want to I'm going to combine two questions we received in advance from some of our audience members. These come from Ritesh Yadav and Arpit Goel. And so the first one is, with globalization in recent decades has come the globalization of capitalism. Is sustainable development alongside globalization possible under these institutions that cater to capitalism? So that's the first. And the second is in a similar vein. It's about the liberalization of third world economies. And it basically, the question is, do you think you made a mistake during the 70s to liberalize third world economics? Do you expect third world economies wouldn't be able to, did you expect that third world economies wouldn't be able to digest their immediate rise, such as in India with the failure of public institutions, weak regulations, and politicians? So two questions on sort of capitalism development and globalization.
Yeah, globalization on the whole, the era of the last 50 years has been a great boost to economic development of the poor countries. The era that preceded it was the era of European imperialism. That was a devastating period for what is today's developing world in Africa and in Asia. European imperialism was a systematic cruelty which promoted development in the imperial capitals of Europe, but absolutely prevented Africa and Asia from developing. And it prevented those regions from developing in two main ways. One was stopping them from basic education, because the imperial powers were completely uninterested in education in the conquered lands and actually blocked it. And of course, also in allowing for any competition with the new industrial economy, which was supposed to be the capitalists of Europe and the United States, not new capital owners and entrepreneurs in the developing countries. It was with independence from European imperialism that a process of economic development began in the former dependent places, and some places have had spectacular success. China is probably the most notable of these. China's 1.4 billion people, 20% of the world population, that was almost entirely poor 50 years ago, and is now viewed as a threat by the United States because it has ended extreme poverty and created a modern, technologically sophisticated economy. And I give China all the credit for it because they've done a great job in promoting development, and globalization was absolutely a key part of that success. It was Deng Xiaoping in 1978 who said that China should open up to the world, that provided the pathway for China to make this huge advance. My own experience in advising countries in Eastern Europe, for example, where I helped Poland to recreate its linkages with Europe, meant a tremendous surge of living standards. In Poland in 19 89, at the beginning of the transformation, Poland was about 1/3 of the per capita income of Germany, right next door, but the Iron Curtain divided the two. And then after 1989 till now, Poland has increased to 2/3 of Germany's per capita income because it's become very much part of an integrated economy. So I think that this is still a core for economic development. But there's another side to it, which also goes back hundreds of years. And I talk about this in the one of the ages of globalization, the age of the ocean empires, starting with Columbus's voyages and Vasco da Gama's voyages. Capitalism, as private ownership of enterprise, has been extraordinarily mean-spirited throughout most of its history. Capitalism is about unleashing of greed. And if that greed is not tamed by the decency of public interest through government, that greed absolutely gets out of control and can destroy anything in its midst. Institutions like New World slavery were not non-capitalist or pre-capitalist institutions in the Americas. They were quintessential capitalist institutions, highly organized, global, multinational enterprise in the slave trade and in the enslavement of African Americans in the Americas. And capitalism started as what we would now use the term profoundly corrupt system. Queen Elizabeth investing in the East India Company, ostensibly a, quote, private company, but really a militarized corporate extension of the state. And that is capitalism. So capitalism is unleashed greed organized in corporate entities, and it generates an incredible amount of fervor and activity, because it is true that the pursuit of wealth is one of the most powerful motivators of human action in history. But on the other hand, it can be the cause of incredible suffering as well. So how do I reconcile that? I think what we learned, especially in the 19th and the 20th centuries, is that there is a middle way. And I'm a great fan of the middle way in general, starting both with the Buddha and with Aristotle, who both preached moderation. We need a middle way between, it could be an all-state central planning, which is a disaster, and a rapacious, unregulated capitalism, which is the dream of Donald Trump, to a middle way where you allow for incentives, even for greed and making money, but it is under the control of ethics and of state power. The state cannot be the prisoner of the companies. You end up with the US, where corporate lobbies run the show, the inequality is extreme, and we can't regulate our companies. So we are one of the most polluting, dirty, unequal societies in the world, though we're rich enough to solve all those problems. But we don't, because the corporations really run the show. We need a state that's strong enough to say to the companies, look, go do your business, but no, do not wreck the environment. Do not disempower your workers. Negotiate with unionized workforce and so forth. And that's why I admire the social democracies so much in Europe or in other parts of the world, but especially in Northern Europe, because they choose the middle path.
One more question that builds on some of those themes you talked about, obviously capitalism, but certainly colonization. It comes from Mautor Alifo. The question is about indigenous populations, that globalization has left large segments of indigenous people behind on the fringes of states. She uses nomadic people in the Sahel as an example. There's plenty of examples around the world, certainly in the United States as well, right? What must the international community do to bring all the neglected indigenous people along in order to bridge the gap of inequality among societies and states?
First, thank you. And let's hope there is truly an international community, not just an empty phrase, because community really means pursuit of a common interest. And that is the idea of the UN Charter, and it is the idea of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the moral charter of the United Nations. And so the hope for a global community is with us. The reality of a global community, when the likes of Trump stand at the podium of the General Assembly and denounce globalists, is not really with us right now. So we're in a battle for the hearts and minds of humanity. This is a continuing battle. It's one, I believe, that education has a fundamental role of importance to play. And that's why I'm so proud of Columbia University, my home institution, also in this regard, because we teach the classics and we teach the idea of the common good, and we teach Aristotle, and we teach the ideas of global community, because I think we believe in them as fundamental for human well-being. So we need global community, and we don't really have it, but we aspire to it. And to my mind, on the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, we should build the UN. It's why it's such a deep shame and travesty that Trump has pulled out of WHO at the height of the pandemic, for example. That is not global community, that is cruelty. Or when he tries to create a Cold War against China, that is recklessness and demagoguery, not global community. You point out that the indigenous peoples have been pushed to geographic and physical margins and demographic margins as well, and this is absolutely correct. It is my experience in work all over the world that almost no matter where you are, the indigenous communities are trampled upon or have been trampled upon in history, whether it's the Native Americans in the United States, or the First Nations in Canada, or the Orang Asli in Malaysia, and countless other indigenous populations. This is very tough going. The indigenous peoples stand witness to abuse. And when there are witnesses to abuse by those who are in power, they typically don't want to hear about those abuses. And so there's violence against indigenous peoples everywhere, and the ongoing poverty. And sometimes you say, why, naively it's asked, I should put it, why is your tribe living in such incredible difficulty? Is that a great cultural tradition? And the answer, are you crazy? We were pushed here. We can barely survive here. This is the last margin that we're allowed. So the idea of protecting the roughly 400 million people who are in indigenous groups around the world is central to the Sustainable Development Goals and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is core to the concept of leave no one behind, which is the most important solidaristic principle of sustainable development. It's why, incidentally, when you ask about capitalism, I would say that the system we need is sustainable development. That means combining market prosperity or market productivity with social justice and environmental sustainability. And within that, private ownership plays a role, but within the boundaries of moral and environmental constraints. And protecting indigenous populations is part of that. In the COVID-19 epidemic, the hardest hit places in the United States are Native American reservations. They are getting pummeled by the disease, And because they're so marginalized in every part of US politics, the suffering, which you can hear about in YouTube and on social media, is unattended by the political system. So it's happening again and again and again. And we should operate according to the moral injunction and the practical standard of leave no one behind. And that certainly means the hundreds of millions of people in indigenous communities need attention and help and face terrible abuses. And the worst abusers, let me just finish, are this ilk of the Trumps, the Bolsonaros, and the other populist politicians whose mode of operation is division, fear, and hate. That's what their power is. And it's very effective for holding power in the short term. It also destroys societies. But think of all of the indigenous peoples in the Amazon right now. It is Bolsonaro's desire to rip them out of their places so that the speculators and the get-rich-quick, thugs can move into the Amazon and grab their resources. So this is not hypothetical, and it's real time. It's very, very dangerous, and you can point out the political leaders who play this game and how dangerous they are.
One more question that came in ahead of time, and then I'll turn it over to Safwan, who I think has been looking through some of the questions that you've all been submitting during the talk. So I'll preface this question. It's from Dr. Musad Al-Razuki. I'll preface it by saying, you posit in the book that we're now in a new age of globalization. We're sort of at the dawn of the digital age, as you call it. And you also mentioned that at periods of great disruption, when we have these transitions, it's often accompanied by war. So I hate to bring it into an even perhaps darker place than we just were with the last question, but Dr. Al-Razuki asks, as the world faces the rising tide of populism, there are echoes of 1918, 1939, and more recently, 1968. His question is, how realistic is a World War III scenario between the eagle, the bear, and the dragon, that being the United States, Russia, and China?
We really were just pushed dramatically into this new age in real time in recent weeks. The digital phenomenon, of course, has been with us, I would say, roughly for 85 years or so. A great genius, Alan Turing, one of the towering intellects of modern history, dreamed of universal computation, a machine that could read endless strings of zeros and ones and basically do any kind of systematic operation on information on that basis. And that became, from that incredible mathematical and conceptual insight in the 1930s, it became the computer age, and now the ubiquitous connected digital age. And so we've been in the digitization of life, of course, for decades. But I think what's happened in recent weeks, which will change how every part of our economy operates in the future. Work from anywhere is going to be a norm. E-commerce is going to be a norm. E-governance is going to be a norm. E-education is going to be a norm. E-payments is going to be a norm. We have been thrust into this new technological age. It's coming with other huge tectonic shifts. The shifts of geopolitical power and influence. I believe that we're at the end of the US era, and that Trump is accelerating the end of the US era, because it's hard to look at him and say, gee, I want to jump into that parade. So what has been a gradual shift in the center of gravity towards Asia, I think is very likely to accelerate. We are in a environmental accelerating crisis as well. So this is what I mean by a new age. And new ages bring tremendous risk because first, the future is uncharted, and the changes are so dramatic that they lead to reaction, they lead to fear, they lead to lashing out by status quo powers. And in the case of the US, they are leading to an anti-China mania, I would say, the likes of which we have not seen in the United States since the early Cold War with the Soviet Union in the late 1940s. Every day, the idea is contain China, break China, surround China. Trump has said he wants to create a new alliance to basically encircle China, taking the G7, bringing in Russia, bringing in East Asian countries. And he says vulgarly and explicitly, we need to get these 11 countries together to discuss China. Well, China's a nuclear superpower, 20% of world humanity, plenty of trade and connections with the rest of the world. To overtly try to divide the world this way is a sheer madness. But of course, in my opinion, Trump is sheerly mad. And this is the direction we're going. This needs to be stopped. And right-thinking people need to say, we don't want the US to lead. We don't want China to lead. We want a world that is governed by law, well-being, human rights, as in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and living peacefully together, not a new division. That's very possible in the cards because that's clearly in the huge interest of the rest of the world. But I was speaking with senior diplomats today who were saying that Trump is using every threat possible to stop opposition to his visions of the new US-led crusade against China. So it's pretty frightening, actually, because the US has a lot of power, a lot of influence, and if we remain in the hands of demagoguery, the risks are really very high. Of course, it's become widely known thanks to the important work of Graham Allison at Harvard University, who has written about the Thucydides trap, as he called it, that when there are rising powers, the dominant power tends to take alarm and the threat of conflict tends to rise. I would just say, God help us if it does. I've studied the Cold War in detail, and we came close to global annihilation on several episodes. Naive Americans say, well, that was easy. We whooped them. We almost destroyed the world on several occasions, and we have to avoid such an approach again. It would be madness to put ourselves at global risk in that way once again.
I would just watch, just quickly, I'm going to turn it over to Safwan, but actually Graham Allison did an interview last week where he was asked about the original skepticism to his premise that the US and China were likely headed for war. And he said that the skepticism is getting less and less. Basically the skeptics are being convinced that this is a trajectory we could be on. So anyway,
it's unbelievable. It's almost as if these players are typecast to follow this script, because what I hear from the US is so juvenile, actually, but so much on tempo that, okay, now we have to go to war against China because it's our great threat. And what is said about China these days, that it is trying to undermine all the basic values of the US-led world, is a comic book. But comic books actually can have devastating consequences when you live out these caricatures. So Graham Allison is absolutely right. They're following the script, but not the script he wants, the script he was trying to warn against.
Right. So we have 56 questions from the audience, and obviously we're not going to get through a good number of them, but let's try. Staying with China, Jeff, I mean, a number of people have asked about China, basically, and you talked about how Trump has accelerated sort of the loss of the United States leadership on the global stage and the rise of China. And you argue in the book that it should not be surprising that China should be rising again, because for thousands of years it led. And there was a short period of time, only a couple of centuries, where it was in the background. So it shouldn't be surprising. But the questions range from Dina Mufti asks, what would be the trigger for China to overtake the US as the leading global superpower with a basket of currencies? William Freund asks about imposing tariffs on China in the hope of making them abandon some of their most objectionable international economic policies. Azhan Kapisheva asks about human rights in China. And that's an interesting question also in the context of the United States having not only lost its leadership on the global stage, and I think the COVID-19 pandemic and the ill-preparedness of the United States to deal with it hurt the image of the US, but certainly what has been going on over the past couple of weeks, triggered by the brutal killing of George Floyd, has also made a big dent in the moral authority, if you will. And there were a couple of other questions also related to Hong Kong and the protests of Hong Kong, and how should the rest of the world and the US in particular deal with Hong Kong vis-a-vis China and vice versa. So I'll give you that bundle of questions to try to address.
I think we should first, to be brief, aim for multipolar world under international law, not a new hegemon. In other words, it's not the UK passing the global leadership to the US and the US to China, but rather the reflection that now we have a global world that can benefit from the global digital technologies, and we have the international rule of law, if we choose to live by it, in the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Second point I would make is that while conceptions of human rights are different in different places, and in the West, they tend to be much more individualistic and emerged from both the ancient Greek and Christian philosophy primarily. In East Asia, they also exist and emerge from Confucian notions of harmony and order, but are also about human rights. And when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted, one of the leading and most influential drafters was P.C. Chang, a brilliant Chinese diplomat and thinker, who, by the way, was educated at Columbia University by Dewey and learned pragmatism from Dewey, our great philosopher a century ago, but put a universal human rights into play that is both Confucian and Western in its orientation. And this is a great hope from my point of view. We should have a serious global dialogue of values to upgrade the ideas of human rights according to deep philosophical traditions and the best of our civilizations. And we can do this, and it would be a wonderful way to build understanding and peace, to find those roots once again and show that there's a common humanity in them, and that we're able to make universal declarations still in the 21st century and make them hold.
So thank you, Jeff. So there are many questions about the global south, and they are multifaceted. Leslie Udwin asks about protests in places like Delhi. Will these protests bear fruit in dismantling systematic discrimination and violence? Will these protest movements lead to direct change? There are questions also about the global south and how it will come out of the corona-induced economic crisis. We've seen protests, for example, before the crisis in Santiago, Chile, in other parts of the world. How will those countries emerge and how will they deal with things? And might it be that along with globalization, we will see greater localization, perhaps, especially in those countries?
I think it's, first of all, true to say it's hard to think of a part of the world that hasn't had huge crises of governance in recent years, and riots, mass protests, instability in the streets, including places where we might not have guessed it. Chile is an example that you mentioned. The United States with dozens of cities in curfew and in protest right now. Paris, which has faced almost weekly protests of the Yellow Jackets in recent months. Hong Kong with all of the instability. So there is clearly a crisis of governance that is a generalized crisis of governance. It's not specific to any one place or any one system. And we should be absolutely humble and working together, not pointing fingers. In fact, the US 2 weeks ago was pointing fingers. Look at Hong Kong. And then the president's calling for putting troops in American cities the next moment. So all countries are in upheaval because the foundations of our societies are in question right now. The pandemic has brought them, obviously dramatically so, but so has the rapid technological change. So has the changing geopolitics. So has the environmental crisis, which is enveloping many parts of the world. And so that's why we need to have a shared vision globally of a way forward. And we came close to that in recent years with the Sustainable Development Goals, or the so-called Agenda 2030, and with the Paris Climate Agreement, to say, look, we're in a shared mess, highly unequal societies, massive technological disruption, big challenges of even basic education, and now pandemic on top of that. So again, the world has shown in the 1920s and 30s, in the Cold War, the capacity to take sides and view this as us against them to the point of self-destruction. It's also shown ways to work together to solve global problems. We saved the ozone level together. We eradicated smallpox together. We have been close up until the last moments to eradicate polio together. We need to stop COVID-19 together, not to have a Cold War in between. So both sides, conflict or cooperation, are possible future outcomes. They're each contagious, by the way. The more successful cooperation is, the more it will build. The more venomous and divisive the politicians are, the more they will be imitated. Bolsonaro is there because of Trump, actually, not just as an independent political phenomenon, but directly aided by the underlying forces of division that brought Trump to power. And I mean that literally in terms of money and politics and technical advice and so forth. So is it going to be the populist dividers, or is it going to be the globalists, to use that word that Trump doesn't like, but is actually the reflection of well-being of people all around the world that understand that we have a common connection. This is really, I think, the biggest challenge of all. If I might, Safwan, I would share towards the closing my favorite words of an American leader of my lifetime, John F. Kennedy, because he talked about this when he was trying to make peace with the Soviet Union after the Cuban Missile Crisis almost got us all blown up. And he gave a great speech, which is my favorite speech. I wrote a book about it a few years ago called Peace Speech. And he said about this very issue, so let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. And Kennedy put it, in a breathtaking way, that we need to make the world safe for diversity. It's not to end diversity. It is to make the world safe for diversity and to find our common purposes. That's really the most important point of our new age of globalization. And boy, is it much starker than I could have imagined even a few months ago.
Right. But Jeff, picking up on that point, and again, my apologies to the audience. We now have 66 questions, and I wish we had time, but people are eager to hear from you, Jeff. People are eager for some sense out of it all, and an outlook on the future. I mean, questions of, will a second Trump administration, what will it do to globalization? Zahi Khoury asks. Sarah Farouki asks about the health consequences of the U.S. withdrawing from who? Another person asks, will the nation state survive globalization? So I know those are very big questions, and if we had more time, I'm sure you would address them. But I'd like to pick on one question that maybe can provide us with a positive note also to end on, and that is from Jose Cordero, and it's one of my favorite questions, because he reminds us how the bubonic plague of the 14th century was followed by the Renaissance, right? And the Renaissance was such a huge marker of development and evolution that it sort of overshadowed a very important period that came before it, and that's the period of Sienese art. And of course, we all know that during the bubonic plague, the entirely half of the population of Siena, Italy, had been abolished. So the question is, coming out of this, do we expect some kind of a renaissance, not necessarily cultural or artistic, although those are incredibly important for human progress. But as you look at the history of the past 70,000 years and the more recent history and the moment that we're going through and everything that you have commented so brilliantly on in terms of not only the pandemic, but the political situation around the world. If you look out 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now, what do you see?
Great. Let me say one word about the Renaissance, which was the European rediscovery of the classic age. And it is itself a phenomenon of globalization that is extraordinary, because a significant part of that rediscovery was rediscovery of the ancient Greeks, philosophers whom I love, like Plato and Aristotle, whose works had been translated and preserved in the great Arab empires, and especially in the great libraries of Baghdad and the great civilizations of Egypt. And it was from Arabic that they came to the university towns of Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries, were translated from Arabic to Latin. And it was from the Latin that they were then rediscovered by the new humanists who created the Renaissance. And so we have all of the great civilizations working together and learning from each other and enriching fundamentally each other. And that is my firmest belief, that underpinning all of this diversity is phenomenal human insight, creativity, culture, wisdom that we need to keep tapping into, need to keep rediscovering so that we can build on it in our own time. If we didn't have, I'll put a bleak point and then I will put the optimistic point. If we didn't have nuclear weapons, I would fundamentally be an optimist without question, because I would know no matter how much damage we could do, we're going to get another chance. And while we have proclivities towards stupidity, we also have capacities towards great achievement. I am just scared to death of terrible missteps. And the more that I've learned in the 40 years that I've been practicing policy making, the more I'm afraid of blunders and errors that come from hate and stupidity. Not blunders that come from mistakes, because that's human. Those can be corrected. It's really the hatred that I can't stand, and it's the divisions that I can't stand, and it's the anti-this and the anti-that one that I can't stand. And as a foreign policy, I always like Jesus's advice, if I might, which is before you point to the beam in the other's eye, look at the mote, or the mote in the other's eye, look at the beam in your own eye. And what he meant by that in moral teaching was look inward, try to improve your own society. It will help the other to improve as well. So I am, the truth is, Safwan, I have to make a confession. I am fundamentally an optimist, as much as history might want to teach otherwise. We stumble. We have the fate that E.O. Wilson talks about, the great biologist whom I cite, when he says we have entered the 21st century with our Stone Age emotions, our medieval institutions, and our godlike technologies. So we're out of kilter with our realities. But we can stumble forward as long as we don't make grave mistakes. And actually, we know so much on a practical level: how to fight a pandemic, how to stop a virus from spreading, how to move to renewable energy, how to end extreme poverty, that if we could stop our bickering and cooperate, we would find out there's more than enough to go around. There's a commonality of interests, and we would get on with it, with solving the real challenges that our generation faces.
Let's hope. Let's hope. It's a great book, and it's a great book to be reading at this time in particular. Lockdown and quarantine has been hopefully a great time for humanity, individually and collectively, to reflect on all of those big questions. And let's hope that we emerge out of this far more sober and far more aware of what we need to do and to move forward with it. I wish I had a copy to show over here. I know David does. David is in Washington. I'm in Jordan, so I had to read it electronically. And we've shared also, because we got lots of questions from people around the world who said, I can't get the book, can I get it electronically? And the answer is yes. And I really, really very highly recommend it. And I want to thank you, Jeff, not only for sharing so much with us today, but for writing this incredibly important, thought-provoking book. And I want to thank you, David. You're great to have you, and to have you frame the conversation in such a wonderful and brilliant manner. So thank you both, and thanks to our global audience for joining us. Bye-bye.